Hey guys and girls, welcome back to Molecule to Market. Well, once again, you'll go inside the outsourcing space of the global drug development sector. My guest this week is Charles Frey, otherwise known as Chuck, who is the VP of Scientific Affairs at Coating Place. He is a really lovely guy, and I really enjoyed our conversation today. Chuck is the VP of Scientific Affairs, as I mentioned, a CDMO focused in Wurster, bottom spray, fluid bed coating, and associated services. It's great for Chuck to give us some of the backstory to Wurster coating technology and how it's really changed the world of formulation development. He also talks about some of the challenges for the Coating Place of being under the radar at times, but nevertheless being seen as the go-to guys for some of the most challenging processing projects in the market when no one else can help a drug sponsor with a particular challenge. Some people decide to focus on our friends at the Coating Place. It's really quite an interesting conversation in terms of some of the family kind of ups and downs and sacrifices and successes that some of the leaders in our space have to go through whilst working in the industry. So we delve a little bit deeper into that. And I think it's a really kind of human element to Chuck's story, which really contrasts his clearly academic and scientific prowess, which is clear to see. For background, Coating Place is a CDMO focused on Wurster fluid bed coating and associated services. Chuck moved to the company in 1999 to develop expertise on the Wurster fluid bed coating process. During this time, he has focused primarily on application of Wurster process and related technologies to meet the feasibility, formulation development, scale-up, validation, and commercial processing needs of clients. Primary interests have included both formulation chemistry and optimization of process dynamics. The company continues to manufacture proprietary Wurster coating equipment for its operations, and Chuck has helped scale, maintain, and expand the company's offering with new fluidization plate designs, new nozzles, enhancing scaling knowledge, and other technical advances. Having spent over 30 years in the space, Chuck has also lectured on the Wurster process and formulations and has contributed several book chapters on the fluid bed coating process and formulations. Thanks as always for listening to Molecule to Market. I really hope you enjoyed today's episode. And if you do, please do us a favor and share today's episode with a colleague, and possibly even if you're feeling very kind today, go onto your app store of choice, give us a little 5-star rating, and maybe give us a positive comment as well. As always, thanks for listening and enjoy today's show. Chuck Frey, welcome to Molecule to Market.
Thanks, Ramen. It's good to be here.
No, it's great to have you here, Chuck, and thanks for making the time to be a guest. And Chuck, let's start with giving our listener a little bit of the backstory of how you got into the industry and your career path to where you are today at the Coating Place.
Okay, well, if I go back a long ways, you get back into the high school days and even middle school days where I had the benefit of having instructors that were able to interest me in science, which I naturally leaned toward anyway. But upon graduation from high school, I was considering getting into veterinary medicine. And it was a challenging career to get into in the state of Wisconsin here in the U.S. because they didn't have a vet school in Wisconsin at that time. And so the best shot at getting into a vet school was the University of Minnesota, where a reciprocity agreement with the state of Wisconsin, they took 17 students from Wisconsin every year. It was actually easier to get into medical school, I think, than it was vet school. But that has changed over time. There is a vet school now, but after a couple of years of college, my interest shifted over into chemistry, and it was a career path I could see, favorable for making an income and that sort of thing. So finished my chemistry degree in 1981 at the University of Wisconsin River Falls, and the question at that time became, what do I do next? Graduate school or a job. And about 6 months before graduating, a friend of mine who had started work a year prior to me at Dow Chemical Company, he said, I've been talking about you at Dow, and I think you should submit a resume. So I did, and I was invited for an interview, and 6 months before graduating, I had a job offer. And this was 1981, which was it was a downturn in the economy that year. So everything was good at the beginning of the year with the job offer. By the time I went to join the company in July, I was kind of curious if I still had a job, and I did. So it was a wonderful place to start my working career. Worked in the analytical labs there in Midland, Michigan. Over 200 analytical chemists there supporting research and production operations, anything that needed analytical chemistry. So I didn't intend to stay at Dow forever. And a lot of people were surprised at that because that was kind of a holy grail of a job opportunity. Once you're in, why would you ever leave? But I did have interest in moving on, and I remember going out with one of the salespeople that came in, and I was working with, and we were talking about what I planned to do long term. And I said, yeah, I don't plan on staying here forever. And he warned me. He said, you watch out. You'll end up meeting someone, and then you'll want to get married, and they'll be from the area, and you won't be able to leave. So I did actually meet my wife there. And shortly after we met, I told her, I don't plan on staying here forever. And she said, good, I'd like to get out too. So it actually worked in my favor. But anyway, I stayed with Dow for about 7 years and then moved on to Betts Laboratories down in the Woodlands, Texas. And they were a company specializing in water treatment, but they had branched out into process chemicals and paper chemistry and that sort of thing. And I was with them for 8 years, and what really moved us to move on from there was a couple of health things within the family. My youngest son, at 18 months old, he had a cranial tumor. And so we were at Texas Children's Hospital to get that surgery done, and it was a pretty trying experience. But anyway, he came out of that without any serious complications, which was fortunate. But shortly after that, my wife picked up a virus, and it was eventually diagnosed as Epstein-Barr virus. But there was a period of time in there where my kids were asking me if mom was going to live or not. And so we got to thinking about moving closer to family, which is up in the north in Wisconsin. And so we moved there in 1996, and I took a job with Gilson Medical Electronics. Gilson is the first company to use computers to control laboratory instrumentation. And it was a wonderful place to work. It was pretty much all a research environment to me, and I was able to do a lot of really fun things. But after 3.5 years there, I was just fortunate. I had run into an old friend like 3 years prior to leaving Gilson, and he recalled my background of getting into chemistry and what I'd done, and he and his brother had recently acquired a controlling interest in the coating place, the company. And so I eventually talked to them, and they were looking for somebody to take on the technical aspects of the company. And looked like a great opportunity, so I jumped on board, and I've been very happy with that decision. And during my career here, it's been pretty much focused on Wurster fluid bed coating technology, which is the bread and butter of the company. And I've been able to contribute in a lot of ways here.
Thanks, Chuck, for giving us the kind of backstory, which takes you to the coating place and kind of the turn of the millennium and where you've spent the next 23 years or so. And And also thank you for sharing some of the, I suppose, personal challenges that you went through on that journey as well. And I'll come back later on to ask about kind of your family and all that type of thing. So you mentioned the Wurster fluid kind of technology. So for me, but also our listeners that are not familiar with that technology, do you mind just, I suppose, in layman's terms, talking about what that technology is and how it helps in drug development, but also, I suppose, just talk us through your 2 decades at the coating place and how that time has been and how your roles have developed during your kind of time in one organization.
Okay. Yeah, when I came, Wurster technology basically was patented back in the 1950s and 60s. Dr. Dale Wurster at the University of Wisconsin was looking initially at ways to coat tablets, and eventually pan coating was what invented pan coating, which better suited that need. But by the mid 1960s, they realized the value of the process for coating small particles. And basically, it changed a lot of things with the development of that technology, because now we had the ability to apply thin or very controlled film coat thicknesses onto particles, ranging in size from roughly 50 or 100 microns up to, say, centimeter size or larger. And the ability to control that film coat thickness and have it uniform allowed so many things. You could formulate the coating for the need, like controlled release technology used quite commonly in the pharma industry and other industries. And you can formulate the coating to meet the need. So tremendous amount of flexibility to do things that wasn't there before. So and Coating Place actually developed from that work at the university. Harlan Hall, the founder of Coating Place, he joined the University of Wisconsin laboratories in 1971. And they largely were working on commercializing the technology, I think, at that time. So there was equipment being built for clients, there were formulations being developed, and so on. And many are familiar with the fluid bed coaters that GLAT Air Techniques manufactures, and that technology was all transferred from the university to GLAT back in that 1970s timeframe, I believe. And eventually, I think GLAT made coaters, but it was kind of a interesting relationship, because I think the university initially had licensed a company in the UK to make Wurster coaters, and they didn't do much with it. And Herr Glatt was very interested in it, but the university wouldn't talk to him. And eventually, I think Glatt made equipment, and they started to sell it in the U.S. And I think when it showed up in the U.S., the university finally said, we've got to do something about this. So the story I've heard is that university sent somebody over to Germany, talked to Herr Glatt, and I think the attitude they conveyed, it was kind of like, oh, it's about time you got here. And so eventually they did transfer the technology to make equipment to Glatt, and it branched out from there. But in late 1976, the university had taken the technology as far as they wanted, and while Harlan was working at the university, they were running into some situations where they had put equipment into other companies, and they were using the process, and they were only using it sporadically through the year. They would use it for production campaigns, and it wasn't run continuously. So when it came around time to run it, from time to time, they would call the university and say, hey, can you help us out? We can't remember how we did it. And so they asked the university, hey, could we go out there and help them produce their product and then come back? And the university said no. The university is a nonprofit organization, so we can't get involved in commercial activities. So when they did decide to discontinue developing the technology, they recalled Harlan's interest in going out and servicing a company. And they said, would you like to buy the technology? So Harlan and his colleague, Ralph Pondell, they bought the Wurster IP from the university. And they continued to surface what was out there and develop new formulations and eventually develop Coating Place into a contract manufacturing organization. Um, so, um, so during the early years, it was very difficult. It was just Ralph and Harlan. This is a bootstrap sort of business. I think Harlan told me their goal initially was to get clear $100 per week per each of them as profit. And you think about that. They're investing all their own money and any money they can get into the business, and they didn't want any outside interests coming in. And I've talked to some clients who were here early on, and they said, "Oh yeah, I remember Harlan and Ralph. They'd be up pounding on those expansion chambers, and they say they need to hire more people." So eventually, they did continue to hire people, and they continued to develop the coders. And but a lot of formulations that were developed, they didn't have the capacity to do commercial work. So the work would go to other facilities, and those formulations would be transferred there. So, but by the late 1990s, I think the company was at a transition point, and that's when new ownership came in. And the new ownership had a goal of keeping it and maintaining it as a privately held enterprise. They didn't. We've seen situations where clients go to have product produced at a commercial contract manufacturing site, and eventually that contract manufacturer might develop a competing product for it, and then they'd have to pull it somewhere else. So I think there was a little niche there in being a privately held enterprise where there wasn't that risk of running into competition from your supplier. But when I joined the company in '99, it was really a lot about developing or bringing clients into the facility. There were tech transfer processes, tech transfers, bringing it in, as well as new formulations that we were developing. And we continue to grow. In 2007, we kind of measure capacity in terms of how many pounds of product or kilograms of product we can produce in a year. And in 2007, we have a way of measuring it, and it's kind of nebulous. But if I use the same reference point, we were at maybe in the neighborhood of 3 million kilograms of coating capacity in 2007. And by 2015, actually by 2017, we're up to 18 million kilograms, so roughly six-fold increase in production capacity. So I was involved in a lot of that work in terms of scaling up and validating processes and qualifying processes and so on. And through those years, we've also added technologies that complement the Wurster process, because clients don't want to come just for the Wurster work. They want you to do the other things that are required around that. So we've integrated capsule filling and tableting and extrusion spheronization and wet granulation. All processes that blend well and support the work that we're doing with our core business. And so that's where we're at today.
And thank you for the backstory. And what I loved the kind of story of the founders, Hall and Pondell, I think it is, in terms of their bootstrapping early days and how they kind of fought off adding any employees and then got to a point where they didn't have a choice. And just out of curiosity, are they still involved today? Or are they still around, or have they long gone since?
Well, Ralph Pondell, he did move on from the business in 1999. And Harlan is still a part owner of the business. He is, I believe he's the chairman of the board for the company. So we retain that history with us.
Amazing. great heritage. And let me ask you, you obviously you talked in great detail about the Wurster technology, and obviously you've added complementary technology since, which makes a lot of sense when clients are coming to you for a variety of integrated services. Just again, this is probably my technical or lack of technical knowledge. So when you think about kind of your Wurster technology, what are the alternative technologies out there? Do customers come to you for that particular technology, or are they comparing it with alternatives out there in the market that can be used kind of instead of that particular technology?
Yeah, there aren't a lot of competing technologies for what we do with the Wurster, depending on what particle size range you're looking at. It really is recognized as the best way to put a uniform coating onto a small particle. And variations of the Wurster process, which is a bottom spray process, um, are a top spray or tangential spray, as I call it. But those techniques are generally more well suited to granulating material as opposed to coating individual particles.
Okay.
So,
Okay. Understood.
in terms of in a lot of particle coating technology, every one that has survived pretty much has a little niche where it works best. And the Worcester really has this niche tied up, I believe.
No, that's fascinating, and you guys are the only company around that do this. Is this your specific IP that you guys have, or is it? I mean, you mentioned obviously Glatt. Do Glatt still offer this service, or is this something specific to you guys in the US?
No, there are other providers that have Worcester technology.
Okay.
And so Glatt had an arm of their company that was strictly for contract processing. Cardinal Health, which they have a division that derived out of the International Processing Corporation, I believe it was, IPC, down in Kentucky. And that facility operates. I think Patheon does work with fluid bed coating. There's quite a few of them out there. We have a reputation, I think, of being a place that can solve most problems if there's a challenge.
Yeah.
And in some respects, sometimes we get the hardest projects because they didn't work somewhere else, and they want to see if it can work. Uh, so sometimes we have more challenges here.
You're listening to Molecule to Market, where we go inside the outsourcing space of the global drug development sector, the podcast for professionals working in the pharma and biotech contract services space.
In the couple of conversations that we've had, Chuck, and your nature, you strike me as the type of guy that likes having those hard challenges when they've been elsewhere and they've shopped them around to other CDMOs and have been met with heads that are shaking and hands on chins trying to work it out, and they come to you. And are you the guy that says, yep, we can deal with this?
Yeah, I feel fairly confident in what our capabilities are and what we can do. And if it is a challenging project, I'll assess it and I'll say, I can give a likelihood of success. And sometimes I'll say this has slim chances, but the client might say this is the only thing that can work, so let's give it a try. But quite often I will tell them where the pitfalls are and what might happen. In general, coming in with a project up front, I could perhaps give a pretty reasonable assessment of what the cost might be to produce that on a commercial basis, depending on volume and so on. So, I feel pretty confident in what we do, and I'm usually on the front end of a lot of conversations with new clients and so on, new projects. So
very good. And I have to ask, so you're 23 years at the coating place. When you joined in 1999, did you envisage that you'd be there for the next couple of decades?
Yes, I did consider it was going to be my final career stop at the time. There's a lot to learn coming in, but what I really love about it is it's a combination of the chemistry background I have with there's a lot of engineering aspects to it as well, and I like both things. I love to model the process and make predictions on what we need to do to make a viable product. And it's interesting, something that comes out of this is, we focused on Wurster coating since the 1970s, basically, the way I look at it. And it's a tremendous amount of expertise. And we have clients come in quite often, and we'll give advice about what we should do and make suggestions and so on. And sometimes some of these things, perhaps they don't comprehend quite what we're saying or understand the importance of it. And what we end up with is they'll go different routes than we suggest. And often it swings around back to what we had suggested immediately, which isn't necessarily bad. We found out what doesn't work, and we've honed in on, yes, this is where we need to be. But I remember going to a conference years ago, and someone spoke and said they're a small company, and they had to hire contract manufacturers to do a lot of their work. And one of their disappointments was that some of them that they hire claim to be an expert in something, and as they get to working with them, they found that their expertise only went so far, and that then they'd have to hire another consultant for this, when they thought they had it all tied up in the first one. And it's funny, we sometimes run into the opposite sort of thing where people come in and work with us because of our expertise, but when we make suggestions about what we should do, they'll ignore it and listen to someone else. It's kind of a funny story on one of the projects where we were having some trouble in the tail end, and it was a relatively simple fix. And we suggested that fix, and one of the people on the team of the client said they couldn't fathom how that could fix the problem. And they said, if that works, I was told this story. They said, if that works, I will eat this batch record. And it did work, and I'm not aware that the batch record was ever eaten. And batch records are pretty big things nowadays, so that would be quite a meal.
Yeah, pretty chunky. And that's fascinating to hear the kind of almost bounce back projects when clients don't kind of listen to your expertise. And it's an interesting one though, right? Because in the time you have been, in the 23 years you've been at the coating place, the CDMO market and the contract services market has, it's a very different place today in 2022 than it was in, the early 2000s. It's a much more expanded, broader, deeper place. And so I think one of the challenges, particularly for virtual and smaller companies, is they will go to CDMOs for expertise, and everyone markets themselves on expertise. And to your point, Chuck, it's very difficult sometimes for them to navigate, what level of expertise that they are getting or that they are accessing, because everyone says they can do everything. So I think reading between the lines in terms of the success and longevity of the coating plays, is it just because you guys have that deep niche expertise in this particular area that at the end of the day no one can offer that depth of expertise? And whether that business comes direct to you on day one or it comes around the houses in the various ways that you've described, ultimately you guys are seen as the go-to guys for this technology. Is that a fair kind of assumption?
I believe that's a fair assumption, and I base that on knowing what I know about the company and hearing comments from clients that we work with. Generally, they really like working with us. It's we service their needs well, and we're very responsive, and we do well in the quality metrics and everything associated with delivery and product quality and so on. So I think we are recognized as an expert in this.
No, I agree. And my observation is funny, just researching the company, and it's not a business that I knew particularly well, but I'd come across the name. I think I originally met one of your team at CPHI in North America, but I'd recognized the name because I'd seen it in some trade magazines in the past and things like that. But my observation about the coating place is you're quite an understated company. So A, is that fair? And B, is that intentional that you guys kind of have quite you aren't intentionally understated and you're happy to almost go under the radar slightly, and you're not as loud and brash, let's just say, as other people in the market?
No, I think management would prefer to be out there. And I think we have a past perception to overcome. When I talked about Coating Place in the early days in the 70s, they bought a facility that was an old concrete facility, basically because it had a building that was tall enough to install a coater. And the coater went in there. But think about all the infrastructure you need for a company. We deal with solvent-based coatings, and so solvent drums would come to the facility on a truck, and they didn't have an unloading dock. So what they did is they put a pile of sand out in the parking lot, I believe, and the truck would back up to it, and they'd roll the drums off and down the hill, and then take a hand cart and bring them in. It's really being creative, to get the job done. Yeah. But people still see that and say, "Oh, they don't have a good enough quality system," or something like that. And when they come to see our facility today, most are very surprised. They're very pleased with what they see here. And so I think there's an old perception sometimes we're trying to overcome.
And you need a good marketing company. You need a good marketing company. I definitely know one. I can tell you that. So I'm not going to, and just for my listeners, I am not going to try and sell our good friend Chuck on the podcast. But yeah, it's fascinating because I think almost part of it's funny, as a marketing guy, I often think, I remember writing a blog a couple of years ago, and all the marketing, you can do all the marketing in the world, but if your product and your service delivery is not good enough, or it's not world class, then you'll get found out eventually. And often the kind of cream rises to the top in terms of if you deliver a solid, consistent service offering in a market, you will naturally be the go-to for something, and you become that word of mouth kind of reputation led business, which my understanding of, based on what you talked about, seems to be the case.
Yeah, and the thing I'll add to that is clients have come in and they see what kind of production capacity we have here, and their perception was all we did was develop formulations. We didn't commercially produce. And so they naturally don't think of us, I think. Mm-hmm. But anyway.
No, it's good. It's fascinating to get your insight. And I wanted to, so obviously you mentioned your family earlier on, and in the backstory when we chatted earlier, I know you're one of 8 siblings, which is fascinating, and I'm sure we could do an entire podcast. Great to hear that. Obviously, given the health challenges you mentioned in your family, 25, 30 years ago now, I'm very happy to hear you've been married to your wife for 40 years and you have three children, presumably all grown up, and it sounds like they're doing amazing things. And what does family look for you today? And I know in the notes that we've got as well, this is the one that attracted me. You can tell just purely my kind of you've got 3 clearly very talented children, but the one is dancer, an actor, and an entrepreneur, and that's the one my eyes naturally navigate, less so the civil engineer or the computer programming person, but which clearly non-offense. But I'm intrigued to hear of family life today. Tell us more about your dancer, actor, entrepreneurial child, because they sound like one of my kids in the making.
Well, I'll tell you about him first, but I have to talk about the other 2. Otherwise, I'll be
of course, yes.
So. But yeah, the youngest, when he graduated from high school, his interest was in performing kind of things. So when he applies to college, it's an audition, and he was going out to auditions, and he told my wife after one, he said, I'm going to be wasting your money if I do this. My heart's just not in it right now. I need to be in Los Angeles or New York City. And so we said, okay. take a shot at it. So he picked Los Angeles, and so we arranged, share an apartment with somebody, and we drove him out to Studio City and dropped him off, and he said, "See what you can do." So for a year and a half, he did things like he's a dancer, so he liked dance, and he was doing music videos for some people. He was extras in movies, some modeling, all that kind of stuff. But after a year and a half, he told us, he said, "I'm ready to leave. I know I need college, and I don't want to be doing it when I'm 25." So we packed him up, drove back to Wisconsin, which he technically was still a resident of. And we got him into the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point to their dance program. And it was a good place for him to start and get some of the undergrad work done. But after a year and a half, he said, I need a higher caliber school. So we said, "Well, what are you thinking?" And he named off schools, and he auditioned at a few, and ultimately ended up at University of Arizona in Tucson. And so he finished his dance degree there, and didn't even walk through graduation. He already had a job on a cruise ship with Royal Caribbean in Asia. So he did that, a few contracts out there. And then I think after that, he landed a job in, I might have the chronology wrong here, but eventually he did a stint in the Caribbean actually as well. And he worked on a show in Berlin, Palace Berlin. They did a show called Vivid, and so he participated in putting that show together, and he worked with it for a year, and then he left that, and he ended up back on a cruise ship, which he liked it because it was a nice way to make some money, a lot of but anyway, this is when the pandemic hit then. So he's in Asia, and they're starting to shut the ship down, and they're stranded on a ship for 3 months, because they think they're going to get off, but they don't, and so on. So anyway, after 3 months, and I won't go into all of that story, but he comes home, and we said, "Okay, why don't you just concentrate on starting your online business you've talked about?" So he did. And within 8 months, he said, "I'm making enough money right now. I'm going to move to Denver." So he moved to Denver, and he's been doing very well out there, and he really likes Denver. But
Great.
Now, do I have time to talk about the other kids yet, too?
You can, of course you can. Yeah, you let us know about your other 2 children as well.
Well, my middle child, my son, he's the computer person. And he had a lot of struggles when he was younger. We had moved from Texas to Wisconsin at kind of a critical age, and it was very challenging for all of us in many respects. But one of the things that when we moved, this would have been back in the late 1990s, it was a time when we got the first personal computer at home to actually work with. And but the thought was, he loved playing around with computers and stuff, and we thought, let's just put it in his hand so he's comfortable with it. And boy, he loved it, and he would do things, and he was always getting them messed up, getting viruses on him and everything else. But all of that made him not fear the computer in any way. You can do anything to it, you can get it fixed again, that sort of thing. So he works for an enterprise resource management software company, and he's got a number of people that he directs, and he basically customizes systems for companies that use that software. But then my daughter, she's the oldest. She graduated from college with an architecture degree, and she got a job in St. Paul, Minnesota with an architecture firm, and she worked there for a couple of years, and she said, "You know what? I feel I need to go to graduate school." And she was really struggling with doing that. And I was on the phone with her one day, and she was talking about worrying about making the wrong decision. And I just told her, well, there's not a wrong decision here. You just make a decision. And what happens is going to determine the person you become. And she told me several years later that lifted a tremendous weight off her shoulders. But she did decided to go to graduate school. She went to the New Jersey Institute of Technology and got a double master's in architecture and civil engineering. And she went to work with an East Coast construction firm. And she was managing construction of, there was a Novartis facility out there in oncology in New Jersey. That was her first project she worked on. And then she went to Portland, Oregon, and she worked on a facility there, managing the construction of that. And then she wanted to do some international work. And she looked at what international projects were available, and she ended up going to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, which is a place she remembered I traveled to for business once, and she thought it would be interesting. So she goes there and she manages the construction of these twin towers, 37 stories, with mixed use underneath. And then that project ends, and just when the pandemic is starting, she's starting to get her move over to a project managing three residential towers around the Merdeka 118 tower that's just being completed this year there. And but with the pandemic in Kuala Lumpur, they have been pretty much locked down all the time. So she had twins in 2019, and ever since they've been born, they've pretty much been in lockdown. So it's kind of like a blast from the past, where finally this year they finally get out into the world. But the only people they know are mom and dad and a nanny.
Wow, amazing. I mean, I sympathize. Our youngest was born in the middle of the pandemic, and it took a while to understand who these strange other people beyond his parents and brothers were. So no, I think incredible, and congratulations on the family success as much as the business success. Chuck, you strike me as a very content guy, if that's fair. You obviously sound like a great parent as well as anything else.
Well, I credit a lot to my wife. I mean, she we were told when kids get into school by people, they said, keep interested in what your kids are doing. Do not neglect it. And she was in there all the way. And you got to kind of protect them a little bit from the system at times. The last thing I'll say about my daughter is they did finally move back, and they moved to Des Moines, Iowa, and we thought, what a transition.
What a difference from Kuala Lumpur. It's quite the contrast and they're very well traveled, your children as well. So I know we're going to run out of time in a few minutes. So one thing I think would be great to share would, obviously listeners of our podcast are working in the contract services sector, either on the vendor side or in pharma services, or, on the kind of drug development sponsor side. You've been in the sector a long time. You've played a pivotal role in the area of coating technology and processing that you operate. What does the future look like for our sector? Obviously, there's quite a lot of change going on, and obviously we've come out of COVID. How do you see the next few years developing? What should people be aware of? And from any vantage point, whether it be really macro things or more specific to dosage forms or capabilities or technology in the area that you operate in?
Yeah, so it's always a good question. Crystal ball isn't always that clear. I know early on at Coating Place, the challenge was we would have, say, some big clients that we work with, and the concern was always we don't want to be tied up with one client too much, because if something causes them to go away, we got a lot of things to fill. We're in a business where we have a certain amount of capacity, and we like to use all that capacity. And sometimes we get tied up in work that's kind of the current trend, and things are going gangbusters for us, but we also recognize that can dry up very quickly as well. So there's a lot of challenges associated with that. And one example I'll give is the opiate or painkiller epidemic, whatever you want to call it. We do controlled substance. We work with controlled substances here. So there were quite a few projects in that area, developing formulations and some in commercial production and so on. And when that pandemic or epidemic started up, all those projects dried up. Suddenly they're gone. And even with COVID, there were certain projects we were working on, and COVID changed the dosing sort of plan or what was ideal for clients and stuff. And suddenly projects that were supposed to be starting production were suddenly cut down substantially and so on. So we've always got capacity to bring things in, but it takes time to bring them in. And we also have had the dilemma of, do we put in the equipment to get the work, or do we get the work and then put the equipment to meet that demand? And most clients, you have to have the capacity in order to get the work. So we recognize, we try to have enough foresight to put the equipment in and then have it here ready to take on the work. But I think the thing I've observed in recent years is sometimes companies in transition, maybe they're purchased by someone and they evaluate all of their processes, and they might say, it makes more sense for us to do the coding work over here. So they might pull it from our production, and maybe we'll become a secondary supplier for them or something like that. But those kind of things happen. Clients are always looking for the best bottom line. So I do think contract processing will remain a business, and whatever area makes sense to work in, because clients recognize, or big producers, they can't do everything in-house. They need people to pick up the things. And at least something like Wurster technology, which is quite specialized, there is a niche there which gives us a good place to be.
Yeah.
So
no, I agree. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, and I think it's great learnings and insights for our listeners. And Chuck, what a great conversation. I'm very grateful that you made the time to come on the show. I appreciate how busy you are, and I'm glad our listeners got to hear your story and get an insight into the coating place and its incredible technology and rich kind of heritage as well. And yeah, thanks again for being a guest on Molecule to Market.
Thank you, Ramen. Appreciate being here.
Hi again. Thanks so much for tuning in to Molecule to Market. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. You can find more shows on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or wherever you like to listen. Get in touch with us on our website, moleculetomarketpod.com, and follow us on LinkedIn or Twitter, and we will see you again next week.
You're listening to Molecule to Market, where we go inside the outsourcing space of the global drug development sector, the podcast for professionals working in the pharma and biotech contract services space. Molecule to Market is sponsored and funded by Remarketing, an international content, digital, and design agency that helps companies get noticed, raise profile, and generate leads in life sciences.